And we are very honored to have with us today, Elena Mustakova. She is going to be sharing with us a perspective from the Baha'i faith. And so this is now going to be a bit of a shift as we start now to look into things that take us into spiritual traditions that maybe do not fall directly into the category of religion per se. So Elena is a spiritual philosopher, evolutionary thinker, educator, psychologist, and social scientist. She's an expert on the systemic links between individual health, culture, moral development, language, and collective social health. She's been quite active in various movements, including the world unity movements, and we have crossed paths there as well. And so I'm delighted to have you with us, Dr. Elena Mustakova. Thank you so much, and I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you, Alexander, and thank you to the wonderful organizers of this forum. I would like to start by letting you know that I take very much to heart the goal that you describe for your forum, which is to build bridges. So I'll try within my 20 minutes of sharing about the Baha'i faith, which is, as far as I know, the youngest world religion, to really put it in the perspective of everything that has been shared so far. I would like to start by saying that in this faith tradition, which originated in the middle of the 19th century, there is no clergy. And so whatever I am going to share today is my individual understanding. Each person relates to this tradition and deepens their understanding. And so you will hear mine. But I'd like to start by taking to heart Chloe's invitation to us to use music in order to really center ourselves in our hearts, because that is the surest path to building bridges. And so if you would allow me, I'd like to chant a very brief prayer, after which I'll go ahead with my few thoughts. Thank you. Oh God, make me a hollow reed, from which the pith of self hath been blown, that I may become a clear channel, through which thy love may flow unto others. O God, make me a hollow reed, from which the pith of self hath been blown, that I may become a clear channel, through which thy love may flow unto others. O God, make me a hollow reed. So friends, from my understanding, the Baha'i faith is very firmly ensconced in an evolutionary understanding of religion, and therefore it recognizes a deep connection and continuity with every tradition that has been represented so far, including the indigenous tradition that will be represented after my chat. And so I could spend quite a bit of time making the connections here, which I have to be economical and mindful of time. I won't go into the depth and extent of the parallels that I see, but just will mention a few things that really stood out for me and then move into the Baha'i faith. Just like our Taoist friend Fred spoke about the emergence of a global language and worldview, which is really supported by Taoist understanding. that is also very much at the center of the Baha'i understanding, which, as I said, originated in the 19th century, that's what we're really evolving towards: a global understanding of faith, a global understanding of humanity, a global understanding of society and evolution. And so your forum is very much serving this purpose. And of course, Hema spoke so beautifully about the movement from oneism to oneness, from professing various beliefs to becoming and living and manifesting that oneness, which in the Baha'i tradition is very much associated with the understanding of history. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And I really appreciated the reminder of Father Safi from Islam, that at the root of the word Islam is the meaning of peace, and that peace within is what is the expression of true faith. And again, that is the journey in the Baha'i faith as well, the journey of every individual and the journey of the collective humanity, a journey towards peace within that is manifested in our way of being in the historical social world that we now inhabit. Very much appreciated what Father David shared as, in his understanding, the heart and soul of the Judaic tradition, which is this bringing together of heart, head, and hand. And of course, the Judaic tradition has always had this strong historical sense of how do we show up in history? How do we show up in real dimensions of society? What perhaps most deeply resonated in my heart is the statement of Father Lawrence that the question of consciousness and sentience is right now a redemptive question. I found that to be very powerful and certainly reflects my, at least, understanding of the Baha'i faith, that at this time, it is really not about these questions in the abstract. It is about these questions as we manifest them in this moment of the dark night of the soul and the evolution of our collective humanity into a global civilization. So these are indeed redemptive questions in the Baha'i faith. And of course, the view of God as pure attention, universal and transformative, yet another deep connection. Zoltan gave us the gift of a very elaborate understanding of the steps and processes of the purification and liberation of consciousness. And again, that is a fundamental aspect of the Baha'i faith, is the importance of the purity of being, attaining and aspiring to the purity of being. So having drawn all of these connections, hopefully makes it clear that the Baha'i faith does not stand as a separate tradition. It is in a way, and yet it's not. It really embodies the oneness of religion and the oneness of faith, and that's how it's practiced. One of the most powerful thing that I personally have found in the Baha'i understanding of consciousness and sentience, and I came to it as a developmental psychologist. I was into my developmental psychology training in my doctoral degree when I encountered the Baha'i paradigm, and I asked, why is this such a well-hidden secret? Why is none of the developmental programs I am aware of mentioning anything about this profoundly evolutionary paradigm? So I had some ears to try to answer that question for myself. But one of the things that it struck me that it does is that it moves us from cosmology to history, and from mysticism to creating a coherent global commons. And so it views consciousness in the context of history, where everything is tested. And for that reason, it crystallizes all of these ancient, profound, principled teachings, about which we heard excellent presentations so far, into crisp and elevating reality propositions. And so in a way, it's a very practical faith, because it brings every aspect of consciousness and sentience back to how is it practiced in the world? What does it mean to really show up, to use Ken Wilber's integral perspective here? What does it mean to truly and fully show up to the fullness of the reality of the modern human being at this time in the world, which is, as we know, a fragmented time, and we experience a lot of fragmentation and reduction and dwindling of consciousness. The Baha'i perspective addresses consciousness in the modern person, both as an evolving spiritual being, a sentient being, and also as a socio-historical being that is in a dialectical relationship with both the immanent and the manifest. And so it looks very carefully at the role of the physical, the social, and historical reality in the evolution of consciousness. So reality is not just simply to be transcended. It is to be engaged. It is to be engaged and transformed in the direction of greater coherence. Of course, in a deepening spirit of detachment and purity of heart. Our collective evolution is an evolution towards unity consciousness, but through a very painstaking historical process in which we are all agents and active participants. So, and that's why I chose the theme of my talk today as collective evolution amidst planetary turmoil and war. And I'm very, very grateful to our Christian brother who spoke at length about Ukraine and being in Ukraine right now and what it means to meditate in the middle of war. So on the one hand, Baha'i understanding speaks very explicitly about the quintessence of being, which is unknowable, and that being the all-embracing reality of the world, whether we speak about it in terms of new paradigm science, which it actually foreshadowed, or whether we speak about it in terms of wisdom traditions. And in one of the hidden words, which are mystical, brief mystical gems, Baha'u'llah says, speaking on behalf of the unknowable, veiled in my immemorial being, I knew my love for thee, therefore I created thee. So I find that to be very magical, veiled in my immemorial being. It also explains to humanity what is our relationship to this immemorial being. And it explains this relationship through the role of the so-called manifestations. And this is a term that I think is pretty unique in this paradigm. The manifestations are these pure mirrors, these embodiments of the quintessence of being that are expressed in the reality of the Buddha, of Zoroaster, of Krishna, of Moses, of Christ, of Muhammad, the Bab, and Baha'u'llah. These manifestations are really the intermediary between the unknowable and ourselves in our evolutionary process. And their purpose, the purpose of these divine essences is understood to be to reflect the divine light. That's why they're such pure mirrors. They reflect the divine light to humanity and show us the way. And what happens is that with the appearance of each next manifestation, this appearance, in fact, engenders such a transformation of individual and collective consciousness, evolutionary transformation, that in fact it engenders a metamorphosis in collective life. And so we know that each wisdom tradition carries a history of metamorphosis in the collective humanity that was impacted by that tradition. And so the role of these beings as they come to humanity is to, and here we come to the role of sentience again at a different level, and consciousness at the level of the human. Their role is to educate the rational mind, to expand human consciousness, and at the same time to model for us the purity of being, the purity of sentience, and to cultivate that within us, to call that forth within us. And so, for example, Abdul Baha in his talks, and this is the son of the manifestation of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, and he's a master spiritual teacher considered in in the Baha'i faith. He traversed throughout the West in 1912, 1913, gave talks all over the Western world. And in one of these talks, actually in 1913 in Paris, he said, "The divine teachers desire man to be educated, that he may attain to the high rank of his own reality." Here's an understanding of the purpose of manifestations, the purpose of religion as the education and expansion of the rational mind, and also the deepening of our sentient consciousness. And again, he emphasizes the power of the rational mind and the responsibility of the rational mind by saying, in the search for truth, man must weigh religious questions in the balance of science and reason. God has given us rational minds for this purpose, to penetrate all things, to find truth. If one renounces reason, what remains? The sacred texts? How can we understand God's commands, and to what use can we put them without the balance of reason? So it's a very interesting dialectic between a mystical sense of being and an emphasis on the capacity of the rational mind to grasp, to understand, and to question, which of course we heard very clearly described in the Buddhist approach to developing enlightened and peaceful mind. It's a lot of questioning and exploration. And then again, the more mystical side of these teachings states that all the visible material events are interrelated with invisible spiritual forces. The infinite phenomena of creation are as interdependent as the links of a chain. So there are many ways in which the Baha'i faith actually foreshadows contemporary evolutionary science and systems theory thinking. And I can't really delve into that a whole lot here, but it is important for me to just note the connections here and to note that the relationship between human consciousness and universal consciousness plays out historically. How does it play out? Universal consciousness, as it releases its forces through the appearance of manifestations, brings about shifts, historical shifts, and those are shifts in collective evolution, but there are also shifts in the evolution of individual consciousness, individual development. But again, these things are not understood in the abstract. What in the Baha'i faith is the evidence of the evolution of conscience and sentience? The summit of this evolution is our ability to really see our oneness, to feel and experience our oneness. So the elimination of every form of prejudice, our ability to embrace the oneness of religion, the oneness of race, the oneness of humanity are tested in practice. That is the test of our expansion of consciousness. This is both a very complex and a very practical process. And that's one of the things that I have found so helpful in this tradition, is that on the one hand, it really explains previous revelations in contemporary language that for me has drawn me much closer to every one of the wisdom traditions that I just heard being spoken of. And at the same time, it also spells out for us what it looks like in this age, in the 20th and in the 21st century specifically, to be reborn from the realm of the material and the matrix of nature, and to attain the reality of perception. What does it mean for our circle of understanding to be illimitably widened? That is tested in our ability to actually experience and become facilitators of genuine brotherhood, sisterhood, overcoming of every racial prejudice. That's very, very central in the Baha'i perspective. Ever since the 12 visit of Abdul Baha in the United States, he spoke about the racial question and the importance of this racial question to be deeply healed in the United States and in the world. And he encouraged interracial marriages at a time when all around him, while he was giving these talks, people were being hung, and there was all kinds of racial violence. He was speaking about and actually facilitated the first interracial Baha'i marriage right there in Washington, D.C. During one of his talks. This profound and also very practical understanding connects consciousness also to different states of consciousness, not just on planet Earth. We heard about the 3 states of consciousness that are recognized in the Hindu wisdom tradition. But Abdul Baha also says that different environments, in fact, will generate different states of consciousness. And so he asserts that there is definitely life, conscious life, on other planets, on every other planet. And this conscious life has different states of consciousness that correspond to the conditions on those different planets. So another very profound and very interesting understanding, I find. So to continue, one of the very interesting things here is that this historical unfolding of consciousness, in fact, happens through 3 protagonists in the evolution of consciousness. And those are the individual, the community, and the institutions. And these 3 protagonists, the individual, the evolving individual whose consciousness and way of being and presence expands and deepens, the community that is building deep bonds of oneness, and the institutions that help and facilitate this process, each have their very unique roles, but they're all bonded by the unique force of love. I'll just mention a few of the aspects of the manifestation of sentient consciousness on the level of the individual. Ervin Laszlo started this symposium today by reminding us that perhaps the universe is sentient consciousness. And of course, our Christian brother reminded us that God became human so that humans can become God. And so the way that we become this universal consciousness in each moment, I could talk a lot about that from a Baha'i perspective, but since we're running out of time, some of the most important ways is that the practice of sentient consciousness in the modern world means to become a promoter of human honor and dignity, the dignity of every human being, the champion of justice, racial justice, social justice. These are critical issues. Seeker of wisdom, of course, a selfless giver, but also a pure channel. And here, just to quote the words of Baha'u'llah, be swift in the paths of holiness. Imagine that. It's one breath away, that purity. Be swift in the paths of holiness. And another one, O son of spirit, burst thy cage asunder, and even as the phoenix of love, soar into the firmament of holiness. Each human has the capacity to be a quickener of humanity. That's how the divine within us shines. And of course, the institutions channel this spirit, and they seek to become the patterns of a new form of divine economy, one which is truly egalitarian, which is truly embracing universalist, which does not distinguish between different, well, it does distinguish, but it embraces every world's tradition, every facet of the human race and ethnic diversity. And that is the role of the institutions. And all of that, and those are my closing thoughts, is tested, consciousness is tested in action. And the most distinctive aspect of action from a Baha'i spiritual perspective is consultative processes. consultative processes on every level, which is why I tried to make all the connections with the previous speakers, because ultimately we will attain unity as we enter a genuinely consultative process on every level, between individuals, between wisdom traditions, between institutions, between nations and cultures. And in that sense, I'll close with the gratitude to the organizers of this forum, who I know are aspiring to create such a space. So thank you.
Dr. Mustakova, thank you so much. A wonderful window into the world writ large and into the dimensions of our own selves in it. And thank you for this.